Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's video, we're diving into a question that almost every believer has asked at some point. How can I recognize God's voice in my daily life? Imagine this. You're driving home after a long day. The sky is painted with fading colors of the sunset. Your mind is racing with to-do lists, unanswered texts, and that one conversation that didn't go as planned. Suddenly, a thought crosses your heart. Call your friend. Check on them. You pause for a second. Was that just your own mind? Or was it God's gentle whisper guiding you toward something greater? Moments like these can feel so small, almost invisible, yet they often carry life-changing weight. The challenge is that God doesn't always speak in a loud, booming voice from the sky. He often speaks in ways that are subtle, quiet, and deeply personal. But how do we know when it's Him? How can we tell the difference between His voice, our own thoughts, and the noise of the world around us? These are the questions we're going to unpack together in this story. I want you to think about a time in your own life when you were faced with an important decision. Maybe it was about your career, your relationships, or even a hidden struggle only you knew about. Did you ever feel a pull in your heart, a nudge that seemed to come from nowhere? Was it a coincidence, or was it God trying to speak to you? What if the choices you make every single day are being shaped by a voice you don't fully recognize yet? Tonight's story is about an ordinary person wrestling with that exact question. Someone who longed to hear God's guidance but kept second-guessing themselves. They prayed, they waited, and sometimes they even doubted. Yet, in the middle of the uncertainty, something happened that forced them to confront the reality of God's presence in their life. And what they discovered will challenge the way you see your own journey. This isn't just about hearing something mystical or supernatural. It's about learning to tune your heart to the one who knows you better than you know yourself. It's about realizing that God speaks through Scripture, through prayer, through people, and even through quiet moments you may have overlooked. And once you begin to recognize His voice, your life will never be the same. But here's the tension. What happens when the voice you think is God's leads you into the unknown? What happens when following that whisper requires courage you're not sure you have? In this story, our main character is about to step into a moment like that, where obedience collides with fear and faith demands a response. Stay with me, because as we walk through their journey, you may find echoes of your own life. You might recognize the same doubts, the same hesitations, and maybe even the same whispers you've been hearing all along. By the end of this series, you'll not only know how to recognize God's voice in your daily life, but you'll also discover the beauty and power of walking in step with Him, even when the path feels uncertain. But first, let me take you back to the very moment it all began. One quiet evening, when the ordinary world was interrupted by an extraordinary call. It all began on a night that seemed no different from any other. The house was quiet, the world outside calm, but inside the heart of our main character, questions refused to rest. They sat alone in the corner of their room, a Bible open on the table. But the words on the page felt distant. They prayed, whispering simple words. God, if you're really speaking, help me to know it's you. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but it wasn't obvious either. It was that in-between place where faith meets doubt, and it's there that the real story began to unfold. For days, they had been carrying a heavy decision. Should they take the new job offer that promised security but pulled them away from their family? Should they stay where they were, even though their heart longed for something different? It felt like every thought was clouded with noise, and they didn't know which direction was God's voice and which was just their own fear. The more they prayed, the more uncertain they felt. And yet, in the stillness, something small started to stir. It wasn't a thunderclap or a dramatic sign. It was more like a gentle pull in the spirit, a quiet sense that they couldn't quite explain. Was this how God speaks? Could his voice really be this soft? Every day they wondered if maybe they were imagining it. Friends gave advice, family shared opinions, but deep inside, they longed for clarity from God himself. How could they recognize his voice when life was so full of distractions? There were moments when the weight of uncertainty felt unbearable. They would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, and imagining possible outcomes, searching for peace that never seemed to last. Yet, in the middle of all that tension, there were brief flashes of something different. Moments when a verse of scripture seemed to leap off the page, or when a passing stranger spoke words that echoed exactly what they had prayed the night before. Each moment felt too precise to be random, but too fragile to fully trust. This was the conflict building inside them, the deep desire to follow God's leading and the paralyzing fear of getting it wrong. If they mistook their own thoughts for his voice, the consequences could be life-altering, but if they ignored him, they risked missing out on the very path he had prepared. That kind of tension is not just part of this story, it's part of every believer's life. The question of how to recognize God's voice in daily life is never a simple one. And for our character, the stakes were about to rise higher than they ever expected. Because one decision was coming, one choice that would test everything they believed, and the answer would change their life forever. But on that quiet night, sitting alone with their Bible and unanswered prayers, they didn't yet know just how close that choice truly was. The conflict grew heavier with every passing day. On the surface, life carried on as usual. Work, family, church on Sundays, but underneath it all, there was a storm no one else could see. Our character smiled when people asked how they were doing, but deep down, the weight of uncertainty kept pressing in. Every decision suddenly felt bigger. Every small choice seemed like it could be the one that either aligned with God's voice or pulled them further away from it. One evening, they sat with a close friend who had faced similar struggles. The friend shared how they once thought they were following God, only to realize later that fear had shaped their choice more than faith. That story shook them. What if the same thing was happening here? What if all their prayers, all their waiting, were clouded by the quiet fear of stepping into the unknown? It was a reminder that recognizing God's voice is rarely simple, and sometimes the answers come in ways we least expect. At the same time, a subplot was unfolding at work. A colleague who rarely spoke about faith suddenly began opening up, sharing how they too were searching for God's direction. Their words mirrored the very questions our character had been wrestling with in private. Was this coincidence, or was God using people around them to confirm something deeper? The timing felt too perfect to ignore, but still, there was no clear direction, only more layers of mystery. With every passing day, the tension built. The desire to follow God's leading grew stronger, but so did the fear of missing it. And then came an unexpected call late one night, one that would force the conflict into the open and push everything to a breaking point. The phone call came just after midnight. The room was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp, and the silence had been almost comforting until the sudden ring broke through. On the other end was a voice they hadn't heard in years, an old friend, shaken, desperate, and asking for help. The timing was impossible to ignore. Just hours earlier, they had prayed again. God, show me if you're speaking. Make it clear. And now this voice from the past arrived like an answer, but also like a test. Every instinct battled inside them. Part of them wanted to believe this was God's voice guiding them to act, to step into something that mattered beyond themselves. But another part whispered doubts. What if this was just coincidence? What if rushing in would only lead to regret? The conflict that had been simmering suddenly reached a boiling point. Recognizing God's voice in daily life was no longer an idea to ponder. It was a decision demanding action. As they listened to the trembling words on the phone, their mind raced back over the past weeks. The gentle nudges, the strange alignments, the scriptures that had stood out, the quiet whispers in prayer. Were all those moments leading here? Could it be that God had been speaking all along, preparing them for this very night? The weight of it pressed hard on their chest, a mix of fear and urgency, faith and hesitation. The silence on the line stretched, waiting for a response. In that moment, it felt like everything balanced on the edge. One answer could change a life forever. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, as if time itself paused, holding its breath for what would happen next. Before they could even answer, another sound shattered the moment, a sharp knock at the door. The phone still pressed to their ear. They froze, heart pounding. Who could possibly be here at this hour? The friend on the line kept talking, their voice filled with urgency. But now there was a second demand pulling at them from outside. The quiet room that had moments ago been heavy with tension now felt like it was spinning out of control. They rose slowly, unsure whether to open the door, unsure whether this was danger or something else. The knocking grew louder, insistent, as if whoever stood outside already knew they were there. Torn between the desperate voice on the phone and the stranger on the doorstep, they felt the pressure closing in. Was God speaking through one of these moments? Or both? Was this the answer they had been waiting for? Or was it a trap disguised as opportunity? The lines between faith, fear, and reality blurred until every choice felt like walking blindfolded into fire. When they finally cracked the door open, the night air rushed in, carrying with it a face they didn't expect. Standing there was a neighbor who rarely spoke more than a passing word, someone who always kept to themselves. Their eyes looked frantic. They blurted out that they needed help. Right now. Two voices, two crises, both colliding at the exact same moment. It was almost too much to process. The prayers for clarity had been constant, the desire to recognize God's voice unshakable. But now, clarity seemed even further away. If this was God, why did the choices feel like traps closing in from every side? Their heart pounded as they realized the stakes were far greater than a simple decision about a job or a small step of faith. Lives were tangled up in this moment. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder, and doubt whispered louder. What if you choose wrong? What if you mistake your own thoughts for God's voice, and someone gets hurt because of it? In that instant, the conflict became almost unbearable. Two cries for help, one from a voice long forgotten, and one from right outside their door, both demanding a response. The tension twisted into something even deeper. Was this God speaking louder than ever before? Or was it a test to see how much they trusted him when nothing made sense? The answer they gave next would not only shape their own path, but could alter the lives of everyone involved. And with both voices waiting, there was no more time to hide in hesitation. The air felt thick as they stood between the phone and the door, caught in the kind of decision that shapes everything. The friend's voice in their ear pleaded for someone to listen, someone to show up, while the neighbor outside seemed just as desperate, eyes filled with fear. For a moment, it felt impossible. Two needs, two directions, one heart desperate to recognize God's voice in the middle of the noise. Taking a shaky breath, they whispered a prayer under their breath. Lord, help me hear you now. It wasn't long, but it was real. And something shifted. Instead of panic, there was a strange peace, not loud or dramatic, but steady, like an anchor in the storm. Their eyes lifted toward the neighbor, and without another thought, they stepped forward, inviting them inside while holding the phone tight to their ear. Somehow, they knew this wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about trusting that God could speak through both at once. What happened next felt almost surreal. As the neighbor sat down, shaken, and explaining their crisis, the voice on the phone broke through in a way that made everything clear. The friend admitted they had been struggling with loneliness, weighed down by thoughts of giving up completely. They had called in the middle of the night, not just for help, but to know someone still cared. And at that same time, the neighbor revealed that they had been at the edge of their own breaking point, carrying a burden in silence until it spilled over tonight. Two lives, two stories, colliding in one room, and suddenly the prayer for clarity made sense. God's voice wasn't about picking one path over the other. It was about stepping into love, listening, and showing up in the middle of someone's pain. The realization hit hard. Recognizing God's voice in daily life often looks less like thunder and more like compassion. Just when relief began to settle in, the twist came. As the conversation unfolded, it turned out the neighbor and the friend on the phone knew each other from years ago, their stories woven together in ways our character never imagined. Neither of them had spoken in years, both broken by their own struggles. And now, through one prayer, one moment of obedience, they were brought face to face again. The climax wasn't just about making the right choice. It was about realizing that God's voice had been guiding them all along, weaving every thread together. And in that living room, with tears, silence, and hope, the story revealed something far deeper, that hearing God is less about perfect clarity and more about trust in the unexpected. The room grew quiet after the wave of emotions passed. The neighbor wiped their eyes. The friend on the phone breathed slower. And for the first time in a long time, peace filled the space. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from having all the answers. It was deeper. The kind that comes when you finally realize you're not alone, that God has been speaking and guiding even when you couldn't see it. Our character sat back, still holding the phone, still looking at the neighbor across the room, and felt something shift inside. All the fear of making the wrong choice, all the doubts about whether they could recognize God's voice, began to fade. The night had shown them that God's guidance is rarely about a single booming command. More often, it's found in the whispers of compassion, the nudges to act in love, the quiet courage to be present when someone needs you most. The friend on the phone agreed to meet with them the next day, ready to talk face to face after so many years apart. The neighbor, once so guarded, promised to lean on others instead of hiding their struggles. And in that moment, our character realized something important. Sometimes God's voice is revealed not through signs in the sky, but through the needs of people right in front of us. Recognizing His voice in daily life is about listening with the heart, staying open, and trusting that He weaves all things together for a greater purpose. As dawn broke, they finally closed the door, set the phone down, and whispered a simple prayer of thanks. The decision they had feared so much had already been made, not by choosing one path over the other, but by stepping into both with faith. And that faith had opened the door for healing, not just for others, but for themselves too. Looking back, they saw how every small moment of doubt, every quiet nudge, every late-night prayer had led to this. God's voice had never been absent. It had been speaking through Scripture, through people, through circumstances, and even through the silence. And now, with renewed confidence, they knew they could walk forward without fear, trusting that the same voice would keep guiding them tomorrow and every day after. The story ends here, but the invitation remains for anyone listening to lean in, to trust, and to recognize that God is speaking even now in ways you might never expect.